Hi, everyone. Quick one for you. Make sure you subscribe and like before we start. Thank you. I sit across from her, the morning light spilling in through the window, casting a soft glow on Laura's face. She's scrolling through her phone, her expression serene. There's a time I would have thought that look belonged to me. Contentment, a quiet moment shared between husband and wife. But that time is long gone, even if she doesn't realize it. I know what she's doing now, who she's texting. It isn't me. I take a sip of my coffee, watching her from over the rim of the mug, my mind already planning the next move. She doesn't notice. She never notices anymore. We've settled into this routine, one where I pretend not to see, and she pretends not to care. Her lies, her deceit, they blend into the normalcy of our mornings. But I see them now, clearer than ever. The cracks in our marriage, once faint hairline fractures, have split wide open. It didn't happen all at once. Betrayal rarely does. It seeps in slowly, quietly, until one day it's there, staring you in the face. I've been staring at it for weeks, maybe months. I can't even remember the exact moment I knew. Maybe it was that night she came home late again, smelling a perfume I didn't recognize. Or maybe it was the way she looked at her phone just a little too long when she thought I wasn't watching. But now I know everything. I've seen the text. I've read the words meant for someone else. I've seen the way she lights up when his name flashes on her screen, and I've made my decision. This isn't about heartbreak or some pitiful quest for closure. No, this is about something much more precise, much colder. I glance at her again. She's smiling, typing out a message with those same fingers she once held my hand with. The anger I once felt has settled into something else, something harder, more focused. I've become calm, deliberate. What happens next won't be in the heat of the moment. It'll be planned, methodical. She'll never know what hit her. I clear my throat, and she glances up at me, eyes slightly startled, like I've interrupted something private. She quickly composes herself, her lips curving into that same practiced smile. "You okay?" she asks, her tone casual, as if we're still the couple we used to be. "I was just thinking," I say, keeping my voice steady. "We haven't had much time together lately. Maybe we should plan a weekend away." Her smile falters for just a fraction of a second, but it's enough. I can see the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of guilt she tries to hide. It's subtle, but I catch it. I always do now. She's thinking of him, of how she'll explain her absence, how she'll lie to me once again. But I don't push, not yet. "That sounds nice," she replies, her voice too bright, too eager. "Maybe next month. I've just been so busy with work." Work, another lie. I nod, pretending to accept her excuse, letting the silence stretch between us. I watch her carefully, waiting for the unease to settle in. I know it will. It always does, eventually. But for now, she returns to her phone, her world, oblivious to the one I'm quietly building around her. I let the moment pass, the tension lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. Soon she'll start to notice things, small things at first. Misplaced documents, appointments she didn't remember scheduling, whispers at work that she won't be able to trace back to me. She'll think it's coincidence, bad luck. Maybe she'll even believe she's losing her edge, but she won't realize until it's too late. By then, her life will already be falling apart, and she'll have no idea that I'm the one pulling the strings. I stand, placing my empty mug on the counter. "I'm heading to the office," I say, my tone light as if it's any other day. As if I haven't already begun tearing down the carefully constructed walls of her life. She looks up again, offering me that same practiced smile. "Have a good day," she says. I give her a small nod, turning away before she can see the cold satisfaction in my eyes. "You too, Etiko," I reply, walking out the door and into the day that I've planned down to the last detail. It's already begun. She just doesn't know it yet. It started innocuously enough. A few late nights here and there, work meetings that ran longer than expected, a shift in how she spoke to me, with just a bit more distance than before. I'd be lying if I said I noticed it right away. Hindsight has a way of coloring the past, making everything that seemed ordinary now shine with bright red warning signs. But back then, I didn't think much of it. We'd been married for 8 years after all. We were settled, comfortable. I trusted her. Laura had always been ambitious. She thrived on the adrenaline of high-stakes deals and fast-paced business environments, and I admired that about her. So when she said she needed to stay late at the office, I didn't question it. Why would I? My own job kept me busy, and there were times when I too found myself tethered to work for hours past sunset. It was normal, or so I convinced myself. The first time it really struck me as odd was after a company party. I remember it clearly now, the way Laura and Richard had stood close together, sharing a private laugh that seemed, in retrospect, to be anything but innocent. At the time, I dismissed it. Richard was an old friend, someone we both knew from way back. He'd been charming, yes, and maybe a little too flirtatious for my liking, but I wrote it off as nothing more than playful banter. Laura had been drinking that night, just enough to lower her guard, and I remember watching her, really watching her. She didn't look at me the way she looked at him. I chalked it up to work stress. I was too tired, too distracted by the demands of my own career to dig any deeper. I wanted to believe in her. I wanted to believe in us. But as the weeks went on, the late nights became more frequent. She'd text me from the office, quick notes like, "Working late, don't wait up," or "This project is taking longer than I thought." She became distant, almost emotionally absent, and when I asked her about it, she brushed it off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're just swamped right now," she'd say, her tone so rehearsed it felt like a line from a script. "You know how it is." I did know, but something felt different, off in a way I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the long hours or the exhaustion that came with them. It was her. She was changing, becoming someone I didn't fully recognize. The little things began to stack up. The night she came home smelling of an unfamiliar cologne, the way she'd check her phone more often, sometimes smiling at something she wouldn't share with me. The distance between us, once subtle, had grown into something tangible, like a wall being built brick by brick, day by day. I was on one side trying to reach her, and she was on the other, slipping further away with each passing moment. I didn't want to believe the worst, but doubt had taken root, creeping into my thoughts like an unwanted guest. Then there was the night I found her phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked and glowing with a notification from Richard. I remember how my chest tightened as I stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." It wasn't a work message. There was no mistaking the tone, the intimacy laced in those few short sentences. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the thread, each message revealing more than I wanted to know. They'd been meeting for months, slipping away in the evenings while I sat at home, oblivious. They had shared private dinners, stolen moments in hotel rooms, places where the weight of our vows didn't exist. And what did I do? Nothing. Not right away, at least. I put the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. The rage that flared up in me was quickly smothered by something else, something colder, sharper. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the floor as if it could give me answers, as if it could explain how my life had become this. But no answers came. Only the slow realization that I had been played for a fool. That night I lay in bed beside her, listening to her breathe, her body curled away from mine, her mind likely somewhere else. She didn't know I knew. She didn't know I had seen the messages or felt the sting of her betrayal in every word she had typed to him. It would have been so easy to confront her then, to shake her awake and demand answers, to scream and shout until the truth lay bare between us. But I didn't. I said nothing. Instead, I began to plan. That's when something shifted in me. Some part of my mind that had always been content to let life happen, to trust in the natural order of things, was snuffed out. I became colder, more calculating. I would not be the weak, broken husband she could simply walk over on her way to him. No, I would do something far more devastating. In the weeks that followed, I pretended not to notice her growing absences, her excuses becoming more transparent, more hurried. I watched her, waiting for the right moment, gathering information piece by piece, Every time she smiled at her phone, every time she rushed out the door with an excuse ready on her lips, I kept my calm. Richard had become a fixture in our lives, even though I had already seen through his charade. He'd been over to our house for dinner just the week before, sitting across from me at the table, laughing at some joke Laura made. I remember the way his eyes flickered toward her, a knowing look passing between them. One I hadn't seen before but now couldn't unsee. It was so clear now. Everything they did had been right in front of me all along, but I had been too blind to notice. There was a party that month, another company function, the kind that demanded formal attire and forced smiles. Laura insisted we go, playing the role of the devoted wife while Richard hovered nearby, always just close enough to be noticed, but never suspicious. I remember watching them across the room, their bodies angled toward each other in that intimate way that only lovers share. No one else seemed to notice, but it did. Later that night, after the drinks had flowed and the laughter had died down, I caught a glimpse of them in the hallway. Their conversation low, their faces too close for it to be innocent. She brushed past me minutes later, her smile strained, her eyes a little too wide. "Ready to go?" she asked, her voice too bright, too eager to leave. I nodded, playing my part, pretending not to have seen. But inside, I was already forming the next move. This would not end with a quiet divorce or a tearful confession. No, when I was done, Laura wouldn't recognize the life she once had. I would dismantle it brick by brick, just as she had done to mine. But unlike her, I wouldn't make mistakes. I wouldn't leave any traces behind. As I helped her with her coat, placing a kiss on her cheek, I whispered, "You know, sometimes you think you know someone, but you don't." She looked at me, startled for a moment, but then the moment passed and she laughed nervously. She didn't know. Not yet. I sat in my office, fingers tracing the smooth edge of the desk as I reviewed the day's events. Laura had left for work in her usual rush, the hurried kisses and barely there smiles that had become her routine. She thought she was safe, comfortable in the web of lies she'd spun so delicately. She was wrong. I had been careful, methodical. Over the past weeks, I'd started putting my plan into motion, and it was working beautifully. At work, she had been dealing with mounting stress, anonymous complaints, whispered rumors, small but critical errors in her projects that she couldn't explain. She was losing her grip, and the cracks were beginning to show. It hadn't been difficult to orchestrate. A few tips sent anonymously to the right people at her office, each one carefully crafted to seem legitimate, had started the wheels turning. A coworker misplacing an important document she'd been working on, an untraceable call to the HR department suggesting improprieties in her work ethic. Each step pushed her closer to the edge. I had set the pieces in motion, but to her, it seemed like everything was falling apart on its own. The real brilliance of it all was that she had no idea I was behind any of it. She still saw me as her stable, predictable husband. I played my role to perfection, offering comfort when she came home frazzled, her mind weighed down by problems she couldn't solve. I listened patiently as she vented, gave her space when she needed it, all the while enjoying the irony that I was the source of her misery. It was only the beginning. Richard had been trickier to deal with. He was, after all, not directly under my control like Laura. But I had found ways to reach him, too. Richard's business was vulnerable, even if he didn't realize it yet. A few well-placed comments in the right circles, a rumor that a project he'd been working on was about to fall apart. Those small pushes had been enough to get people talking. Soon enough, his clients were second-guessing him, withdrawing their trust. His confidence, which had once been so smug, was beginning to falter, and I relished every second of it. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the memory of our last dinner together, the one where Laura had invited Richard and his wife over, playing the part of the doting spouse. The entire evening had been a charade, one I participated in with perfect ease. Richard had sat across from me, oblivious, laughing at some trivial joke while Laura made small talk with his wife. The undercurrent between him and Laura was palpable, but neither of them suspected that I knew. That night, I'd orchestrated the first real move against him. I had used the conversation to subtly plant seeds of doubt about one of his key clients, hinting at financial instability that wasn't real but plausible enough to cause him concern. Richard had laughed it off at the time, but I saw the slight crease in his brow, the way he glanced at Laura when he thought I wasn't looking. The insecurity had been born. I had planted that doubt knowing it would fester. People like Richard, successful, arrogant, had one fatal flaw. They believed they were invincible until the moment their foundation started to crack. And once those cracks appeared, they would do anything to keep the walls from tumbling down. I had set him on that path. Soon he would be scrambling to maintain control, just as Laura would be scrambling to hold on to the life she thought she had. Over the next few days, I increased the pressure on both of them. Laura was already unraveling at work, but I made sure her troubles multiplied. Another tip, another anonymous complaint. This time a more serious accusation about inappropriate behavior with a client. It wasn't true, of course, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make her question everything, to make her believe that her life was spiraling out of control piece by piece. Richard, too, was feeling the weight of his life coming undone. I knew from my sources that his business was struggling more than ever. He had taken on too many risks, and the whispers I had started about his instability were now becoming louder. Investors were pulling out, clients were looking elsewhere. He was beginning to realize that the world he had built for himself was far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. But the beauty of my plan was that neither of them knew I was behind it. Laura would come home after a long day, exhausted and anxious, and I would be there playing the supportive husband. I would listen to her complain about the office politics, about the inexplicable string of bad luck that seemed to be haunting her, and all the while I would nod sympathetically, offering reassurances that she would get through it, that it was just a phase. She believed me. She had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. She couldn't afford to doubt me, not after everything we had shared, not after the years we had spent together. To suspect me would mean to admit her own guilt, and she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to face the reality of what she had done. Richard, on the other hand, wasn't as easy to manipulate. He was more distant, more detached, but even he was starting to feel the strain. His calls with Laura became less frequent, more curt. He was distracted, preoccupied with the mess I had quietly created for him. The same mess that was now threatening to consume him. The turning point came 2 weeks later when Laura's company initiated an internal investigation. The accusations against her, false but plausible, had escalated to the point where HR could no longer ignore them. She was suspended, pending the outcome of the investigation. I remember the night she came home after hearing the news. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she told me what had happened. "They think I've been inappropriate with a client," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said there's evidence." I had to work hard to suppress the smile threatening to curl my lips. Instead, I played the concerned husband, pulling her into my arms and whispering that everything would be okay, that we would figure it out. She clung to me, desperate for reassurance, her mind too clouded by fear to see the truth right in front of her. The investigation dragged on, each day a new torment for her. She spent hours on the phone with lawyers, trying to clear her name. Her coworkers distanced themselves, whispers and sideways glances following her wherever she went. And through it all, I remained her rock, the one constant in the chaos she believed had come from outside forces. She never suspected that I had been the architect of her downfall. As for Richard, he was faring no better. His business was crumbling and the financial strain was beginning to show. He was losing clients faster than he could replace them, and the stress was taking its toll on him. His relationship with Laura had become strained as well. He was too consumed by his own problems to provide her with the emotional support she needed. The affair that had once brought them excitement and escape was now nothing more than a burden. I knew it wouldn't be long before the final blow landed, the one that would shatter both of their lives beyond repair. The beauty of it all was that they would never see it coming, not until it was too late. They had been so careful, so convinced of their own invincibility, that they had failed to realize the true danger lurking beneath the surface. The final phase of my plan began with a single email. It was simple, direct, and devastating. I had gathered enough evidence of their affair, texts, emails, photos, things that were never meant to see the light of day. I sent the package anonymously to Laura's company, to Richard's business partners, and to a select group of people in our social circle. The fallout was immediate. Laura's suspension turned into a full-blown termination. The scandal was too big, too public for her company to ignore. She was finished. Richard, too, faced the collapse of his carefully constructed life. His reputation, once sterling, was now in tatters. His clients fled, his investors pulled out, and the affair that had once been his secret pleasure was now the cause of his ruin. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Everything I had worked for, every piece I had moved into place, had led to this moment. Their lives were in ruins, and they had no one to blame but themselves. I sat back in my office watching the news break, the headlines that would forever be associated with their names. It was done. I had won. But as I sat there, a strange feeling settled over me. Not the satisfaction I had expected, but something darker, something colder. I had achieved everything I had set out to do. He had dismantled their lives, piece by piece, just as they had done to me. But instead of victory, all I felt was emptiness. Laura had destroyed our marriage with her lies and betrayal, and Richard had been her willing accomplice. But in the end, they weren't the only ones who had lost something. I had lost too, not my career, not my reputation, but something far deeper. The person I had been before all this had vanished, replaced by someone else, someone who had been willing to sacrifice everything for revenge. I stared at the screen, the headlines flashing before me, and I realized that I had become the very thing I had despised. I had destroyed them, but in doing so, I had destroyed a part of myself. And now there was nothing left. Nothing but the ruins of a life I could never rebuild. Revenge had been my purpose, my driving force. But now that it was done, I was left with the one thing I hadn't anticipated, a hollow victory. I didn't stumble upon the truth by accident. It came to me in a slow, creeping wave, building as the small details began to stitch together. I found out one evening alone in my home office, going through emails on my laptop when Laura's phone, forgotten on the kitchen counter, buzzed. A quick glance at the screen sent my heart into a slow, steady freefall. Richard, I can still taste you. It was meant to be quick, just a casual check to see who had messaged her. I never expected to find the truth I did. The name hit me like a sledgehammer. Richard. I knew Richard well, had known him for years, a colleague, a man I had once considered a friend. The familiarity of his name made the contents of the message all the more disgusting. At first, my mind recoiled, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a joke, a misunderstanding. Maybe there was some inside joke I wasn't privy to. I wanted to cling to those justifications because the alternative was unbearable. But as I scrolled further through the messages, it became undeniable. The messages were not ambiguous. They were intimate, full of passion, longing, and plans. Their affair wasn't a mistake. It was a deeply orchestrated betrayal that had been going on for months. I felt like I had been hollowed out, the air sucked from the room, leaving me numb. There, in the space of a few minutes, my life, my marriage, disintegrated in front of me. But the numbness didn't last long. Rage followed, not the explosive kind, but a slow, simmering fury that settled deep inside me. The kind of rage that doesn't burn out quickly, but instead calcifies, hardening into something far more dangerous. I closed the phone gently, careful not to let it lock before placing it back exactly where she had left it. I needed her to stay oblivious. Confronting her right then would have been satisfying in the short term, but I knew it would solve nothing. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be colder. Revenge, if I were to take it, had to be calculated. It had to be devastating. I went back to my laptop, stared at the emails on the screen without seeing the words, and made a vow to myself. I wouldn't confront Laura. Not now. Not ever, perhaps. She wouldn't see this coming. By the time I was done, she'd lose everything she valued, and Richard, that smug bastard, would crumble right alongside her. The first few days after my discovery were the hardest. The weight of knowing something so monumental, while still having to pretend nothing had changed, was unbearable at times. Laura continued her routine as if everything was normal, as if our life together hadn't already started to unravel. She'd leave for work early, come home late, offering tired excuses about long meetings and back-to-back calls. I nodded, gave her the space she pretended to need, and used the time to plan. The first step was gathering more information. I needed to know the full extent of their affair. Dates, times, places. I needed evidence, proof not just of her betrayal, but something I could use later, something that would ensure she couldn't wriggle out of the destruction I was about to lay at her feet. I started by quietly monitoring her phone. She had become lax about locking it, so I had full access to her messages with Richard. There was no shortage of evidence. Every conversation felt like a stab to the chest, but I steeled myself, reminding myself that this wasn't about hurt feelings. This was about control, about taking back the power she had stripped from me. She talked to him about everything, how stressed she was at work, how our marriage had become too comfortable, too predictable. She talked about how she longed for the excitement Richard provided. And he, in return, stroked her ego, feeding her the kind of attention she seemed to crave. They made plans, secret rendezvous in hotel rooms, lunches at secluded restaurants. I documented it all, every conversation, every hotel confirmation, every photo they shared with each other. The second step was isolating her, slowly pulling away the safety nets she'd built around herself. I started with her work. Laura's career had always been important to her. She thrived in her position, had worked her way up through the ranks, earning respect from her colleagues and superiors alike. It would hurt her more than anything else to lose that sense of achievement. I used an anonymous email to tip off her company's HR department about her inappropriate relationship with Richard. It wasn't difficult to frame it as a professional conflict of interest, especially considering the high stakes of the projects they both worked on. I made sure the evidence I provided was solid, enough to raise questions, enough to get the right people talking. Within a week, Laura began to notice the shift. It started small, tense meetings with her supervisor, projects being taken out of her hands, the quiet, subtle distancing of colleagues she had once been close to. She came home one night, her face pale, her movements stiff with stress. "I don't understand what's happening at work," she said, slumping down on the couch, her voice laced with frustration. "It's like everything's turning against me all at once." I looked at her, feigning concern. "What do you mean?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "First, I was pulled from the Lawson project without any explanation. Then I heard rumors that HR is investigating something, but no one will tell me what's going on. It's like they're preparing to push me out." "Push you out?" "That seems extreme," I said, my voice carefully measured. Just enough sympathy to appear genuine, but not so much that it would draw suspicion. "I'm sure it's nothing. Maybe it's just the normal stress of the job." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperation I hadn't seen before. She needed reassurance, needed someone to tell her everything would be okay, and for the first time in our marriage, I had no intention of giving her that comfort. While Laura's world at work was slowly falling apart, I shifted my focus to Richard. He was harder to reach, more insulated from the chaos, but everyone had weak spots. His business was successful, yes, but it was built on reputation, on the perception that he was a man of integrity and professionalism. All I had to do was crack that facade, and the rest would follow. I began by planting rumors. I knew a few of his key clients personally, had attended the same networking events and dinners with them. Over drinks, I let small comments slip, nothing overt, just enough to cast doubt on Richard's character. "I heard some troubling things about Richard's last project," I'd say casually, as if it were nothing more than idle gossip. "Heard he might be overextending himself, cutting corners to meet deadlines." The rumors spread faster than I anticipated. Richard, like Laura, began to notice the shift in his business relationships. Clients who had once been eager to work with him were suddenly harder to reach. He began losing bids, contracts slipping through his fingers, and just like that, the foundation he'd built his career on began to crack. Laura, of course, had no idea what was happening to him. Their affair continued, though the strain of their respective careers started to bleed into their secret rendezvous. Their texts became less romantic, more frustrated as they struggled to find time for each other amidst the chaos. I watched as both of their lives slowly unraveled, and it was glorious. The final phase of my plan required precision. By this point, both Laura and Richard were vulnerable, distracted by the collapse of their professional lives. But it wasn't enough to ruin them individually. No, I needed to make sure that when they fell, they did so together, and that their destruction was public. I gathered the most damning evidence I had of their affair, screenshots of their messages, photos of them together, hotel receipts. I compiled everything into a single package and, using a burner email account, sent it to every person of consequence in their lives. Laura's colleagues, Richard's business associates, even some of our mutual friends. The fallout was immediate. Laura was fired within days, her company citing breach of ethics and inappropriate conduct. The scandal spread quickly, tarnishing her reputation beyond repair. The whispers and rumors followed her everywhere she went, and soon enough she was effectively blacklisted from her industry. Richard fared no better. His clients fled, his investors pulled out, and his business, once thriving, began to collapse. The scandal had tainted his name, and no amount of damage control could save him. But the real blow came when the affair went public. Their personal lives, once hidden in the shadows, were now laid bare for everyone to see. Their spouses, friends, and families turned against them. Disgusted by the betrayal, they had nothing left, no one to turn to. The life they had built on lies had crumbled, leaving them with nothing but the wreckage. Laura came to me the night it all fell apart. She was a shell of the woman I had once known, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow with despair. She stood in the doorway of our bedroom, her voice barely a whisper as she asked, "Did you know?" I looked at her for a long moment, considering how to respond. I could have lied, could have played the role of the betrayed husband until the very end, but there was no need for that anymore. "Yes," I said simply, my voice cold, devoid of emotion. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stop me?" "Because you didn't deserve to be stopped," I replied. "You deserve to lose everything." She sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. But I felt nothing. The rage that had once consumed me was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. I had won, but the victory was bitter. I walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the floor. There was nothing left to say. When I first discovered the affair, I felt every emotion at once: rage, despair, disbelief. But in those moments of paralyzing pain, I realized something else. I wasn't a broken man. I wasn't weak. I wasn't going to cry or beg or plead for explanations or apologies. No, I would do what I was always good at: think, calculate, and destroy. And now, standing at the center of the wreckage I had so meticulously created, I knew I had succeeded. But as I watched it all crumble, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling settling into my bones. Laura's life was in ruins. I had engineered her downfall so perfectly that there wasn't a piece left standing. The fallout from the affair had devastated her both personally and professionally. Once admired by her colleagues, she was now the subject of hushed gossip, avoided by everyone she once considered a friend. Her company had terminated her contract, citing the scandal as a breach of ethics. With her reputation in tatters, she had no chance of getting back on her feet. As for Richard, he was a shadow of the arrogant man he had once been. His business collapsed in the wake of the scandal. The trust he had so carefully cultivated with his clients was gone, and his reputation as a man of integrity had been torn apart by my carefully placed rumors and leaked evidence. He had lost everything he had built, all because he couldn't resist what didn't belong to him. And it was all so easy, but watching them fall, there was no satisfaction in it anymore. The cold, calculated revenge I had spent so long planning had left me feeling empty. I had expected to feel a sense of justice, of closure. Instead, all I felt was a yawning void where once there had been rage. The final confrontation came after everything had already burned to the ground. Laura, pale and gaunt, knocked on the door of my study one evening. It had been days since I had spoken more than a few words to her, my silence as intentional as every other step in this plan. She opened the door slowly, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. I nodded, motioning for her to sit. She didn't take the seat, instead standing in the doorway, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. I I don't understand how this happened," she said, her voice cracking. "I've lost everything. The job, my friends, the life we built, everything is gone and I can't figure out why. I just need to know. Did you know?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her with a calm that even now surprised me. There was no anger left, no desire to lash out. I had done what I came to do. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I've known for a long time." Her eyes widened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or realization. "How long?" "Long enough to put this plan in motion," I replied, my tone flat, devoid of emotion. "I saw the messages. I saw everything." She stumbled back, gripping the doorframe as though the weight of my words had physically knocked her off balance. "But why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront me?" I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor as I moved. "Because you didn't deserve a confrontation. You didn't deserve my anger or my tears. You didn't deserve anything from me, Laura. So I did what I do best. I took control." Tears welled in her eyes and she shook her head, trying to piece together the gravity of what I was saying. "You did this? All of it? The bow mob, the rumors, the scandal?" I nodded. "Every piece, every step. While you were sneaking around behind my back, I was laying the groundwork. You think I didn't notice the late nights, the unexplained meetings, the way you'd look at your phone with that little smile you thought I wouldn't see? I saw everything." She collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs filled the room, a sound that once might have pierced my heart. But now it felt distant, irrelevant. "I was going to leave him," she whispered through her tears. "I wanted to fix this, fix us." I leaned against the edge of my desk, staring down at her with the cold detachment I had perfected over these last few months. "It's too late for that, Laura. You destroyed us the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. You, you broke this marriage the second you let him into your life, and now you're facing the consequences." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, searching my face for something, mercy, forgiveness, anything. But there was nothing left to give. "I loved you," she said weakly, as though those words could somehow undo everything. "You loved the idea of me," I said. "You loved the stability, the security I gave you. But when you got bored, you threw it all away. You didn't love me, Laura. You loved what I represented. And now it's all gone." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura sat there broken while I stood over her, the architect of her ruin. I should have felt triumphant. This was what I had worked for, what I had sacrificed everything for. But as I looked at her, a pit opened in my stomach. Was this really what I wanted? Was this destruction worth the burden? She stood slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hollow, defeated. I didn't answer immediately. I hadn't thought that far ahead. My entire focus had been on the revenge, on making her pay for what she had done. I had never stopped to consider what came after. "You leave," I said finally. "There's nothing left for you here." She nodded, resigned. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, and just like that, it was over. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Laura had packed her things and left without another word, disappearing from my life as though she had never been there in the first place. I knew she had nowhere to go, no one left to turn to, but that wasn't my concern anymore. I had thought that with her gone, I would feel relief, that the weight of the betrayal would lift, but instead the emptiness grew. I wandered through the house, each room a reminder of the life we had once shared, the life I had destroyed. I couldn't escape the silence, the oppressive quiet that had taken hold now that everything was over. I had won, hadn't I? I had destroyed the people who had wronged me. I had taken back control. But as the days passed, I realized that revenge hadn't brought me the closure I had hoped for. It had consumed me, hollowed me out from the inside. I had spent so much time focused on Laura and Richard's downfall that I hadn't noticed what was happening to me. I had become someone else in the process, someone cold, detached, calculating. The man who had loved Laura, who had once believed in our marriage, was gone. I had buried him along with everything else, and in his place was a stranger, a man who had orchestrated the destruction of two lives but had no idea how to rebuild his own. One evening I sat alone in the living room, a drink in my hand, staring at the fading light outside. The house was quiet, empty, just like me. I had achieved my goal, but at what cost? I had lost more than just Laura. I had lost myself in the process. And now, as I sat in the wreckage of my own making, I wasn't sure what came next. I had spent so long plotting revenge that I hadn't considered what life would be like once it was done. There was no satisfaction in victory, no sense of justice. Only a hollow, gnawing emptiness that reminded me of what I had become. I stood up slowly, walking through the house, each step echoing in the silence. I stopped at the doorway to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and stared inside. The bed was perfectly made, the room untouched since Laura had left. But it felt foreign to me now, like a place I no longer belonged. I realized then that I couldn't stay here. This house, this life, it was filled with memories of a man I no longer recognized. The only way to move forward was to leave it all behind, to walk away from the destruction and start over. But I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know who I was anymore. The man I had been was gone, and the man I had become, he wasn't someone I wanted to live with. In the weeks following the public exposure of Laura's affair, I found myself drifting through memories of our marriage, moments from the past that now felt like a cruel mockery of everything I thought we once had. Laura's betrayal wasn't a sudden rupture. It had unfolded gradually like a slow bleed, each lie eroding the trust we had built over the years. As I sifted through the wreckage, I realized that the woman I had loved no longer existed. Perhaps she had never truly been the person I thought she was. It wasn't just the affair with Richard that had shattered our lives. It was the depth of her deceit, the coldness with which she had orchestrated an entirely separate existence while maintaining the facade of our marriage. There were moments, looking back, that I could see it all so clearly now. The times she came home late, the way she distanced herself from me in small but significant ways, even the way she laughed at Richard's jokes when we were out together. Each of those moments had been a warning sign, but I had been too blind, too trusting to recognize them for what they were. I thought of the dinners we had shared with Richard, the casual camaraderie that had once existed between us. He had been a friend, or so I believed, someone I had confided in. I remembered one evening in particular, not long before everything began to unravel, when the three of us had gone out to dinner. Laura had been glowing that night, her laughter a little too easy, her smile a little too wide. I had attributed it to a good mood, maybe a glass of wine loosening her up, but now I saw it for what it was, a performance. Even then, Richard had been slipping into our lives, his presence a slow, insidious force that had crept into every corner of our marriage. At that dinner, I recalled how his hand had brushed against Laura's arm, how she had smiled at him in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I had brushed it off at the time, excusing it as nothing more than friendly affection. But now, that memory felt like a slap in the face, a moment of blindness that I would never forgive myself for. I had once been someone who believed in the inherent goodness of people, someone who believed that trust was something sacred, unbreakable. But Laura and Richard had changed that. They had shown me how fragile trust really was, how easily it could be shattered with a few well-placed lies and moments of betrayal. And in the aftermath, I had become someone I no longer recognized. The memory that haunted me the most, though, was the night Laura and I had met. It had been at a friend's party, One of those crowded, loud affairs where everyone mingled and drank too much. I had noticed her immediately, standing by the bar, her laughter cutting through the noise like a melody. There had been something about her, something magnetic, captivating. We had talked for hours that night, and by the end of it, I was certain I had found the woman I was going to spend the rest of my life with. That memory now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of how wrong I had been, how naive. I had built our life together on that first impression, on the belief that the woman I had met that night was real. But the Laura I had married had become a stranger long before I discovered the affair. As I sat in the quiet of my house, the emptiness of the rooms pressing in on me, I realized how deeply her betrayal had cut. It wasn't just the affair, it was everything. The lies, the deception, the way she had pretended for so long, keeping me in the dark while she lived an entirely different life with Richard. It was as if I had been living with a ghost, someone who had once been real, but had slowly faded away, leaving only a hollow shell behind. And it wasn't just her. Richard, too, had played his part in the destruction of my life. He had been the one to step in, to take what wasn't his, to feed off the crumbling foundation of my marriage. I had once considered him a friend, trusted him. But in the end, he had been just as complicit in the lies, just as willing to watch my life fall apart for his own selfish desires. I thought about the last time I had seen Richard, before the affair had come to light. He had been confident, smug even, as if he knew something I didn't. And in truth, he had. He had known all along that Laura was slipping away from me, that she was giving herself to him in ways she hadn't given herself to me in years. And he had reveled in it, enjoyed the power it gave him. But now he had nothing. His business was in ruins, his reputation destroyed, all because I had made sure of it. There was a part of me that had expected to feel triumphant in that moment, to feel vindicated as I watched the two of them fall. But instead, there was only emptiness. The revenge I had so carefully planned, so meticulously executed, had left me feeling hollow. I had won, but at what cost? In the weeks following the exposure of their affair, I tried to make sense of the person I had become. I had always been methodical, careful, someone who believed in control and precision. But the lengths I had gone to for revenge had surprised even me. I had destroyed Laura's career, her reputation, her relationships, and I had done it all without a second thought. I had become someone cold, detached, capable of tearing apart another person's life without blinking. I thought about the moment I had first discovered the affair, the way the world had seemed to shift around me, the way everything had suddenly clicked into place. In that moment, I had made a decision not to confront Laura, not to beg for explanations or forgiveness, but to take control, to make sure that she and Richard paid for what they had done. And I had done just that. I had taken back the power they had stolen from me. But now, standing in the wreckage of our lives, I wasn't sure what that power was worth. I had won. Laura and Richard had lost everything just as I had intended. But as I looked around at the empty house, the quiet that seemed to stretch on forever, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost something too. The person I had been before all of this, the man who had loved Laura, who had trusted her, was gone, and I wasn't sure if he would ever come back. The truth was, I didn't know who I was anymore. The revenge that had consumed me for so long had defined me, driven me. But now that it was over, I was left with nothing but questions. Who was I without that drive for revenge? What was I supposed to do now, with nothing left to fight for, nothing left to destroy? As I sat there staring at the fading light outside the window, I realized that I had no answers. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, in this house filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. I had to leave to find something new, something that wasn't tied to Laura, to Richard, to the revenge that had consumed me for so long. But where would I go? What would I do? Those were questions I couldn't answer yet. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, in this place that felt like a tomb, a grave for the person I used to be. I stood up, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and walked through the house one last time. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do when I got there. But as I walked out the door, leaving the house and the memories behind, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. And for the first time in months, I wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. When I finally confronted Laura, the look on her face was everything I had anticipated: shock, disbelief, horror. Each emotion washed over her in waves as I laid it all out for her. There were no tears, no screams of denial or anger, just a stunned silence as she absorbed the gravity of my revelation. She had been caught in the web I had carefully woven, a trap so meticulous that she hadn't even realized it was being built around her. I knew from the start, I said, my voice calm, almost detached. Every message, every hotel room, every lie. I watched you destroy everything we built, and I decided to return the favor. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She was too stunned to speak, too paralyzed by the sudden realization that everything she had been running from had caught up with her. There was no escape now. The life she had tried so desperately to preserve, balancing her career, her social standing, her affair with Richard, it was all crumbling, and I had been the one to set it in motion. I stepped closer, looking her dead in the eyes. You thought you could lie, that you could cheat, and I wouldn't find out? That you could betray me, and I would never know? My voice was low but steady. Every word landed like a stone. But I did know, Laura. I knew, and I decided that you would pay for it. Slowly. Methodically. She slumped against the chair, her face ashen, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. I could see her brain racing, trying to piece together how I had managed to orchestrate everything without her noticing, how I had planted the seeds that would bring her and Richard's lives to ruin. I ruined your career, I said bluntly. The anonymous tips to HR, the rumors about your ethical violations, the whispers I spread about your so-called professional behavior. Every single move I made was calculated to tear down everything you held dear. And as for Richard, he's nothing now. His business is gone, his reputation in shreds, and he has no one left to blame but himself. She finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. Without, her voice cracked as she spoke. Why do this? What do I sorry, mom? I, I repeated, feeling the familiar simmer of cold fury beneath my skin. Because you took everything from me. You took our life, our trust, and you tore it apart for your own selfish needs. I didn't just want to hurt you, Laura. I wanted you to lose everything, just like you made me lose everything. The room felt heavy, the weight of my words pressing down on both of us. I had planned this moment for so long, rehearsed what I would say, and how I would feel when I finally confronted her. But now that it was here, now that I was standing before her, victorious in every sense, I didn't feel the rush of triumph I had expected. There was no satisfaction, no vindication. Only emptiness. Laura looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears that she barely managed to keep from falling. I never wanted it to be like this, she said, her voice trembling. I never meant to. I cut her off with a sharp shake of my head. Don't try to justify what you did. Don't tell me it wasn't your intention to destroy us. You knew exactly what you were doing every time you went to him, every time you lied to my face. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly, knuckles white. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. I'm so sorry. For a moment there was silence. The apology hung in the air between us, weightless and hollow. It was too late for apologies. Too late for anything to be fixed or undone. We had crossed the point of no return long ago. I don't want your apology, I said quietly. I want you to live with what you've done, just like I've lived with it. I want you to feel the weight of your choices, the consequences of every lie you told. She bowed her head, and for the first time in months, I saw her as vulnerable, as broken as I had once been. But I didn't feel pity for her. I didn't feel anything at all. I had become too numb, too consumed by the revenge I had so carefully plotted. Finally, she stood, unsteady on her feet. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I watched her for a moment, considering the question. What did happen now? I had spent so long planning this, so long focused on bringing her and Richard to their knees, that I hadn't thought about what came next. What came after the revenge, after the victory? "You leave," I said, the words falling out as if they were the only thing that made sense. "There's nothing left for you here." She nodded, accepting the truth of it. Without another word, she walked past me, her footsteps slow and heavy, as if each step took every ounce of strength she had left. The door closed softly behind her, and then she was gone. I stood there, alone in the silence of the house that had once been filled with memories of our life together. The house where I had plotted my revenge, where I had watched her unravel, and now it was just me. I should have felt something, triumph, satisfaction, even relief. But all I felt was the cold emptiness that had taken root in my chest long ago. I had won, yes. I had torn her life apart piece by piece, just as I had planned. But in the end, I was standing in the wreckage of not just her life, but mine too. As I walked through the quiet, empty rooms, I realized that the revenge I had sought had come at a cost. It had consumed me, turned me into someone I barely recognized. And now that it was over, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had achieved everything I set out to do, but in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. The man I used to be, the man who had loved and trusted, was gone, and I wasn't sure what was left. I stood at the window, staring out into the fading light of the evening, my reflection faint in the glass. I had won, but as I looked at the man staring back at me, I couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? The silence answered me.